Good Wednesday evening, or you're watching Direct Line. Our special guest today is Ethan Gutmann, China expert, old friend from the old NET Free Congress Day hat tip, Paul Weyrich. And our hosts today are Mark Unkefer and Garrett Zahner. Take it away, guys.
You know, Dwight, I was expecting you to introduce this properly for Ethan. Ethan, he should be announcing good morning, because is it not morning where you are in Taiwan right now?
I just rolled out of bed 45 minutes ago, guys. Let me be honest about that.
So you're a little ahead of us. By way of introduction, you are author of several books on China, and we were talking offline that you're working on another. I know we've in the past had you on the show and talked about your book about the slaughter, which is about mass killings and organ harvesting. But I think it's also interesting that one of the books that you did was the one of the earliest books that was critical of the relationship with China, Losing the New China, the story of American commerce, desire, and betrayal. And that was done not quite 20 years ago, 2004, but you must have been writing on it 20 years ago. So how do you feel now, after almost a generation now, about sort of the change in attitude that many Americans have gone through from when you were then, where there was this kind of hope, this aspiration that there would be this fantastic market and there would be this symbiotic relationship, to sort of an evolution in the way people approach China?
I think it's, on one hand, I have a very visceral reaction. Is like, well, I said this all in my book, and it came out in 2004. I said, this is the direction it's going. You think this wave of commerce and materialism and advertisements are just going to sort of overwhelm this rotting system in China, and the party is irrelevant now. And I was saying, no, that's not happening. Actually, it's starting to go the other way. And the internet is the key driver of that. The internet is the new way of enslaving people. It is the telescreen. That was all true, and it was right. But so what? People have to discover this in their own way. And, it is the most disturbing period, I feel, has been watching this virus, SARS-2, COVID-19, whatever you want to call it. And I'm sorry to go a little emotional here, but to see people mocked for suggesting this was a lab leak, where, we have a lot of experience from the Soviet Union that they used to have accidents all the time. And they would sometimes intentionally put out what they thought were relatively benign viruses to see how quickly they spread. Now, I'm not saying that happened here. I really, honestly, how would I know? I'm not there with a clipboard. But clearly something went wrong. And as somebody who originally sort of, Occam's razor kind of said, well, maybe it was spread in the wet market. I originally felt that way, but then the evidence started to come in that this was very unusual. And the fact that the virus kept so easily mutating and going through the entire human population. I said, well, wait a minute, that's not zoonotic. That's not from an animal. That's not from a bat. This is something very different. And, if you go back and look at the Black Plague, you see that the spread it did go through animals as well. This wasn't happening here. So I think the fact that it took this long is very frustrating for me. And it basically took the businessmen, especially the Mormons, getting kicked out of China, or just China becoming an inhospitable place to live. The zero COVID policy that China took on helped a lot with that. And now, without people on the ground who are directly advocating going native and advocating for China and lobbying for China in Washington, D.C., we're finally beginning to see that kind of liftoff. Balloon or no balloon, okay? It's not really about the balloon. It's about China's competitive nature. It's about what they're writing about us. They've been very clear now that this is we're into the Cold War, and it could become hot. You understand that very clearly also when you're in Taiwan, because this is a kind of well, I don't know, on the beach scenario to some extent, except we're the first. We'd be the first to go here, not the last. But I mean, even the expats are discussing, what is the Buddhist monastery we go into in the middle of Taiwan and kind of hole up in when the invasion happens. We discuss this quite seriously. We're talking about how to get arms and all those issues.
So let me kind of pursue that a little bit, since you are in Taiwan and you've been there, I guess, just about a year.
No, October 1st. I came October 1st. I came in October 1st.
Shorter term. I'm sorry. But to talk about the reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, obviously there are parallels there that must be very uncomfortable for the people in Taiwan.
I think so. I mean, look, there's, it's interesting to read there's particularly conservative perspectives on the war in Ukraine, and there is a split, obviously, within the Republican Party on this to some extent. The perspective here, to me, it's a little bit easier. I would go sort of for you don't need to overthink this too much. Afghanistan fell. It fell because of Biden's mishandling, because he put it, like a lot of bureaucrats, he sort of thought, I'm being a good boss when I put a date on something. It's like, well, no, that's not actually being great leadership. But he did. He put a date on it and said, I need to give this speech on 9/11, and you're going to get out before that. Basically, Putin and Xi did get together and a plan that they were going to take Ukraine, Russia was going to take Ukraine, and China was going to take Taiwan. And then the question became, who goes first? And obviously, the Russians, because they're the weaker partner, wanted to go first. They wanted to, because that gives you a certain power. The initiative would then pass to them. It hasn't gone the way they expected. I don't think there's any big conspiracy about why. The Ukrainians, even with substandard equipment, have put up a hell of a fight. Nobody can deny this. Taiwan is looking at that and going, we haven't even thought about defending ourselves for a long time. We just assumed that the U.S. would come to our aid. And obviously, the most successful defense strategy for Taiwan has to be, you assume the worst. You assume the U.S. will do nothing. You take it, Taiwan spends a lot of time sending people over to Washington, D.C. to study the American reaction. How do we get America to get that tripwire and join immediately? In fact, they should be sending everybody to Israel and Ukraine. These are the two states they need to learn from, right? And they are starting to do that now. But clearly, it's too late for this country to build the kind of industrial capacity, a military-industrial complex, the way that Israel did, where you build way more than you need and sell off the surplus, and it becomes somewhat self-financing. This was a very, very effective strategy, and it has been for Israel and continues to be. But having said that, I've looked at the opinion polls over here, and quietly, people are ready to fight increasingly. So there is certainly something to fight for. This is an amazing country. The GDP per person is about to surpass Japan's. That basically makes it the wealthiest country in Asia in a personal GDP. Now, people don't feel that way because it's all about the microchips and so forth, and that's where the big money is, right? So people don't feel rich, and they don't want to pay a lot of money for their defense. But nonetheless, this is what's happening. This is an extremely wealthy country all of a sudden. And we'll see how that plays out. We used to see this with NATO during Cold War, was that you sometimes would, I forget who it was who used the phrase, I think it was over the Dutch, and they sort of said the Dutch have decided to have a first-class ticket to hell. Okay, basically. Maybe Taiwan is heading in that direction. I think this is this election now coming up is going to be key. I would like to see the U.S. just treat this as a more straightforward movement. But every day that is a good day for the Ukraine is a great day here, okay? Because it means that invasion is staved off a little longer.
Yeah.
Every day.
If we could go back to the Taiwanese and their willingness to defend the island, this is something that's I've been really puzzled about and very interested in, especially because of the most recent elections have been actually a huge change for Taiwan, especially with the fall of the Kuomintang, which were the ruling party for a large majority of its history. So how do you think that change and the nationalist movement versus the independence movement, people that want to be more who want to be recognized as Taiwanese and not really as the Republic of China, how do you think that really plays into their willingness to defend themselves? Because it has been noticed that the Kuomintang, which the nationalist party who want to recognize themselves as the successor state of China, are now actually have been accused and have been willing to go into negotiations with Beijing more and more compared to the more independence movement.
Can I simplify it a little bit? Because I think that's we've kind of gotten into I don't think the independence issue is real anymore. I think basically KMT people, let's call them blues and greens. So blues are the KMT, the original Kuomintang, and the Greens are the DPP, and they're the supposed independence advocates and all the rest of it. The fact is, everybody's kind of saying the same thing now. They're all saying, "Look, we're an independent country de facto. It doesn't really matter what we call it." And even the KMT is kind of letting that one go. The difference between the two parties now is that the DPP says all the right things. Okay, it says we're going to fight. We're there to. We are basically an independent country, and we're absolutely a democracy, and we're going to fight for that. And that's all really reassuring. There's one problem. The past does interfere. The DPP people were killed by KMT people when this was an authoritarian state. Now, that goes back way before you were born, okay? But it did happen. And that means that there's a mistrust between the military, particularly the army, with the DPP. So that is President Tsai. I'm tempted to pull out. I have a nice bottle of Chinese hooch that has her picture on it, if you'd like me to pull that bottle out at some point. Now, the KMT, the Kuomintang, the blue, the problem there is they're very mainland. They're mainlanders, essentially. So they like to make a deal, okay? That's their first, okay, let's make a deal. Let's work something out. Now, that sounds pretty appealing right now. And then they get along with the military. They get along just fine with the army. Okay, that sounds pretty appealing right now. Yeah, go ahead, make a deal. Make a deal for the next 5 years or something, and then build up, right? Build up necessarily. Or do you trust them to do so? So we have problems, American perspective. I don't care if you're Democrat or Republican. You should have problems with both of these parties, okay? Neither one is perfect. And the best thing we could probably do as Americans to stalemate is just start communicating directly with their military. In other words, we should be sending over a kind of a great guy. I'm not going to call him a czar or whatever, but just some great military advisor who should come over here and kind of take charge of the army, okay? In conjunction with the Chinese, because I don't think they'll have a problem with that. But that's what we need, not just training. We just literally need to restructure forces here. It doesn't mean they cannot just have a defense, a porcupine defense and so forth. They need to have a defense which matches the Chinese on every level, okay? Not nukes, but every other level. And perhaps Japan may take care of the nukes, Korea may take care of the nukes. So we need that. The second thing is the preparation for what we need here, which is really kind of a more of a NATO situation, something a little more formal, okay? We don't need to do that right now, but down the road, that's clearly what's necessary. And what we need to do is force China to go to go into Central Asia and go after India instead. Okay, that's they have to have some direction they're going to expand in. Maybe that's too simplistic, but you can see that there are problems in the interior. I personally do not find myself aligned with either party. Maybe a little bit with the DPP, but not the Katie sort of shares my values more about society to some extent. In some ways, I'm more culturally compatible with them as a kind of a traditional conservative. But I can also see the problem. I don't want to make a deal with China. This is not the time to do so. Yeah. This is not the time to do so. We should be moving deals with China. We should be isolating China as much as possible.
Let's turn a little bit more directly to China and talk about, obviously, the big change took place was the third term for Xi. What are your thoughts about that, and how does that change the? Why don't you elaborate on your thoughts about how that has changed and is changing the sort of leadership structure in the PRC?
You slipped out for a second there, so I didn't quite catch it. I think you're talking about containment, but maybe just.
No, actually, it was a separate. I was actually just talking about specifically about the impact of the third term for Xi and how that's changing Chinese politics. Whereas before, perhaps there was a little bit more of a consensus among the leadership. We now really have a strong man who is the all-seeing arbitrator of Chinese policy.
No, yes. Look, the point is we don't know how irrational she is at this point. I think that's what's come out of this grab for power. I think we were talking before we went on about his treatment of Hu Jintao at the Party Congress. That was unbelievable. It was damaging to the Chinese to treat him in that way. Done nothing wrong. He had not led a cultural revolution. He had not taken out people in the streets because of his foolishness. That's very unusual. And it was a glimpse into how difficult the process in a leader in China. That it's really, we think and people marching the streets and so forth. That's nothing in China. So we don't know his motivations right now. What we do know is the military construction program. Very, very similar to what Russia has been doing, with one difference, which is that they're better. The Chinese are technically at this point, and to some extent technically ahead of us in certain areas, but they are no longer looking to do asymmetric warfare completely. They are looking to take us on at every level, and so that is truly a Cold War. And so if we're in a Cold War scenario, the one thing we know that can work is to that I'm saying sort of isolate China as much as possible, and force them to only move in directions that we want to see them move. We don't know what they're willing to risk at this point. And Xi Jinping has shown himself to be irrational in a number of ways. The COVID, everybody can see for themselves. The zero COVID policy was irrational. It was to legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party on, we have very few cases of COVID. This is, meanwhile, let go to hell. The construction program, the real estate situation is precarious and disastrous in China in a way I've never seen it. I've never been this kind of guy, the kind of Gordon Chang coming collapse of China kind of guy. I'm not that, okay? I've never said that. I've always said, no, the Chinese are very clever. Even if it looks like a mess on paper, they will figure out entrepreneurial ways out of this. And that was true. And I've been right, and Gordon Chang is a friend of mine, but he's been wrong. Okay, he can hold that book up again and again, but it's not going to happen.
I think for part of Gordon Chang's challenge is that the book was written a decade ago, so it's a lot's happened since then, right?
Well, okay, but it was written I think came out in 1997. Boy, everybody bought that book. All the businessmen who were going to China saw that book in the airport bookstore and said, I'll read that on the plane, way back.
Right.
Whatever. But the point is, there's nothing wrong with making a wrong prediction, but I tend to not make predictions too much. I just because partly based on that, I'm just like, well, you can't just looking at some banking problems and say they don't have enough money and it's all going to go to hell. This is different. What we're seeing now in China is a genuine, Xi Jinping has built up a perfect surveillance state. So it's made it very hard to protest and demonstrate. But that has never fully stopped demonstrators before and protesters before. They've figured out ways around it, and they will figure out better ways than just holding up a blank piece of paper, okay? That's not good enough, all right? I got to come up with something else. But it's a very unpredictable situation right now, and I defy anyone to predict China's movements at this point. Their isolation is self-imposed to a great extent. They have been kicking out foreigners ever since Beijing had that stupid Olympics. Okay, that was their announcement. It wasn't a welcoming to the world. It was just slamming the door on the world and saying we can do our own economy. We can do whatever we want. We don't need you people anymore.
Well, let's drill down on that. You talked about the construction, and there obviously a couple of years ago, one of the Gordon Chang scenarios was this notion that China has been borrowing massive amounts of money, and this construction that was channeling so much capital resources into building housing, multiple units that were empty, that weren't being sold, that were being just held for investment. So this prediction has been for a number of years that that's not sustainable, and yet it continued for many, many years, more than a lot of people expected. So we are, though, after the last, I think, it's a year and a half, I guess. I don't know quite when you would time it, but sort of the first defaults of the major developers do seem to have a change that's taking place in that market. Now, you referenced the fact that there are all these unfinished projects. Can you elaborate a little bit about what's happening in that real estate market now?
Well, part of it is COVID. So because they've held on to the zero COVID policy longer than any other country, maybe New Zealand, whatever. So that did inhibit construction. And we may be just seeing an overhang on that. Okay, so I want to put a caution in there. But we have never seen so much unfinished floor space ever in China. We're not even close. And I'm talking even in a relative way, we've never seen it like this. So that is very unusual. And don't forget, they do not have a lot of ready investments, people ready to invest money in China right now. That's not happening. Businesses are moving out because it is not a profitable market. It's not a great place to produce things anymore. That's the main thing. It's gotten a little too expensive. What happened with Foxconn and at Apple with the COVID rebellions in the factory scared people. In the business climate, it is not a comfortable place. India looks a lot better. Indonesia looks much better. So I think you're going to see a lot of movement in those directions. Personally, I mean, I'm not making it. I won't write a book on it and call The Coming Collapse of Chinese Real Estate. I'm not going to do that. Okay? But I will say I think that's where we're at. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say the one thing that has terrified me, in addition to the construction issues and the development in China, has been also the sheer amount of rise in their consumer debt. I was an economics major in college, and sovereign debt was my focus and my specialization. But I was really interested in the sheer amount of consumer debt that the Chinese households have started to accumulate, which has been at a far higher level than any other developing country or developed country in the world. It's over 100 billion more than the United States in US dollars. And it's been rising from 2021 to 2022 was around 11% increase, which was nuts. So I think not only are we going to see a massive problem with their developers and their banking and their sovereign debt, which will become an issue in the coming years. But I also think we're going to be seeing a huge amount of problems for their just everyday regular consumers, having problems paying their mortgages, having problems just paying off their regular credit card bills, which have been increasing exponentially over those years. And I think that's going to put even more pressure on Beijing to decide to lash out, I think, especially against Taiwan, in order to try to place blame and try to solve their problems with an external enemy instead of an internal.
Yeah, I mean, this is the New York Times theory of war, right? Is that, a state goes to war to for
Them's
its own
fighting
people.
words. I was just going to
Yeah,
say.
well, to unify. Well, that's to unify
it's
the
okay.
population. Well, the New York Times theory of war is garbage. They always apply it to America. That's the problem with it. It doesn't unite America. Americans don't unite about wars that much. It's a very iffy proposition. Sometimes it works that way, but mostly it doesn't. So it's not really true about democracies. It is true about authoritarian states, okay? Or at least dictatorships. Dictators believe it's true, and so they often use it. And
especially if they have control of the media.
Exactly. I mean, having complete control of the media and pretty much control of the population, you can do that, which is why it does not disturb me that I don't see patriotic parades going on in Taiwan every day, spontaneously. This is not an authoritarian country. They don't have to express themselves that way. The Ukrainians didn't before they got invaded. The Israelis really do that much either, okay? The democracies don't tend to do that, and they don't need this to unify. They unify in their own messy way. But I think you're right, certainly about though some of what you're describing, the debt overhang and middle class debt overhang and so forth, is just a phase of all the tigers have had this phase to some extent. Not like China. Again, it's the size that scares people, that worries people. In this case, well, again, I'm not going to do a Chang prediction on that. I just think we're in a very interesting period because of the Chinese have basically taken down their population by 200 million. They've just said, oh, we got it a little wrong. Now, there is where you're absolutely right. And the Chinese can read the writing on the wall. I mean, they don't have a birth rate. Their birth rate is getting comparable to Japan's now. Okay.
They have an impending population.
They do. That's right. They have a huge amount of males who can't get married. They sent a lot of them over to Xinjiang to sleep with the poor Xinjiang wives, the Uyghur wives, while their husbands were in the camps. This is terrible stuff. But that is the fact. They're not producing babies. They have a massive elderly and sickly population. I say that as somebody who's getting on the elderly side myself. Having a little tooth work done here in Taiwan. Look, the bottom line is that that is the long-term picture. And yes, it does, it does make one worried. They sort of have to go now, or when do they go? This is maybe the peak of power, but maybe it isn't. And the Chinese have to have some belief in their own momentum of their military-industrial complex, and so forth. What is needed right now is extremely strong leadership that is completely unflinching. So this business where Biden stands up and goes, we're going to defend Taiwan, and then his advisors walk it back. He's done that, 5 times now? Maybe 4. But this isn't good. And the Trump shoot a cuff about this wasn't so good either. We really need somebody coming in here who will just lay down an American policy and stick to it. I'm sorry, but Cold Wars do require a certain kind of consistency because they are team efforts. Okay.
There needs
to be a red line.
Yeah, well, but you've referenced was that for 50 years, I guess just about 50 years, we've expressly not had a red line. We've had the dotted line policy of the two China policy. I guess let's elaborate. You're suggesting that we should change that and make it an explicit red line.
No, I'm not. I'm not saying we have to do that officially in any way. But the dotted line thing is interesting. You just use that phrase because that's what China's done with the South China Sea, right?
The 8 dotted lines.
They've invented this dotted line that somebody put on a map at one point and sort of said, oh, well, that's the line. And that's kind of what we have to do too. Okay, is we have to treat it as if it is de facto while still maintaining the sort of face-saving arrangements of the past. I don't see the point in this isn't a legal case. This is where we're dealing with very irrational tendencies of the Chinese right now. It is not in their interest to go into this war. We had recently, the most recent war game which came out showed them losing a tremendous amount of men, and we'd lose a lot too. And everybody, we'd all end up with bloody noses, and Taiwan would probably hold. I mean, that's not really something to get very excited about here. Okay, so all I'm saying is we need to operate as if we were in the Cold War. Okay, so for example, with Germany, what did we do with Germany? Did we feel the need to settle what Germany was going to be after the Cold War was over? No, we didn't. We didn't touch that. Why? Because the Europeans hated the idea of touching that, right? The idea of a unified Germany was terrifying to them.
Margaret Thatcher's biggest fear.
Yeah, well, not just Margaret Thatcher's. Listen to my Italian friends were just like, this is a disaster, right, when the Cold War ended. And maybe they were right. I mean, okay, but, the point is, so, yeah, I don't think it's the legal aspect. We need to build a kind of defense structure around this. And we need to pull Japan in fully. They have now doubled their defense budget. That's significant. We need to see Taiwan needs to go from 2% to about 4% of GDP on defense spending. They do have this card, this weird card that they make all the computer chips, and the only good ones. We're not going to take over that. We're not going to be able to duplicate that in the United States because it's an art and it requires very, very skilled people. And some of those people are not going to be women. Okay, so it's not going to fit into some quota. That's not the way Taiwan did this. Okay, it's almost like I've been actually, one of the things I'm going to try to do before I leave is get a tour of some of those factories. Let's see if I can get any kind of insights into exactly the kind of person it takes to build that industry. Because you
probably can't take pictures, but that's another conversation.
No, leave your cell phone in the lead box when you walk in, and probably check your testicles too. I don't know.
You made a reference to the sort of Cold War and containment, and it does strike me that there's, I guess, an analysis or a comparison to be made between the sort of historic Russian foreign policy of this, land-based power that was forever on the move and forever trying to take over more territory. And I don't know precisely how to call the historic Chinese superpower dynamic of a kind of shock and awe, if you will, in which countries around it turn to China because China is so strong. And it has been historically somewhat, at least compared to the Russians, which were an expansive power, they were, a more sort of more focused on their own country with the expectation that countries around them would come to them. Is that an outcome? Are we making a mistake to assume that the Chinese are going to follow this historic Russian policy of sort of perpetual territorial aggression?
I don't know. That's the answer to that. I mean, look, it
is the $1 million question, I guess. Yes.
It's the dilemma. Look, this is the dilemma of a Cold War, was that, but it turned out it wasn't so bad. Okay, when Gorbachev came in, and it took him a couple of years, Reagan recognized that something had shifted. He really recognized. He recognized it way before his advisors. I knew lots of people in the Pentagon back then. And they said, this is a trick. The bear is still out there, and, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, maybe not. Maybe this is a real shift. And he recognized it as such, and he went into some very odd negotiations, like the one in Iceland, but they got to know each other, and he was able to, manage decline of the Soviet Union. Okay. And of course, that's our goal. It's manage decline of the Chinese Communist Party. It's that simple. Yeah. Manage decline. So to do that, you have to keep a somewhat open mind. Yes. But it turned out we could do that. We could walk and chew gum at the same time. And I don't mean to go on about how wonderful the Cold War was, but it really was, okay? Because it did show that, especially on the conservative side, that there was this ability to kind of do both. All right, which is something you do not see on the Democrats. The more liberal side tends to kind of lurch in directions with China. as they are right now. Okay.
Yeah.
Even the policy of shooting down weather balloons was kind of along that lines. It was like, shoot them all down, whatever it is, shoot them down, because we didn't shoot down the first one in time. And look, so I think it is possible to do this, and it is particularly possible with China because it is not the Soviet Union. It is a brilliant culture. Chinese culture is fantastic. It is superb. Anybody hang out here in this country for a little while. It's amazing thinkers, great people, extremely polite and courtly environment. So I just want to say we can do that. We should be able to do both. But the party is the idea that we're going to continue to give face to the Chinese Communist Party. This has to end right now. Legitimacy? No, nothing. What I've been studying for all these years and researching and is true. They've been killing their own people, doing it right now at a rate of about 35,000 Uyghurs a year are being killed for their organs. They're 28 years old. They're at the prime of their life. Some others. This is absolute havoc, and we shouldn't be having any. And I had some good news I want to announce on this program. Actually, if you don't mind me carrying on for a little longer.
Please.
The International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation is the collection of all the heart and lung transplant doctors in the world. And I don't want to say that they're more respected than kidney transplant doctors or liver transplant doctors, but they are. Okay, it's like if you're from, it's like saying I'm from Cuba, not from Honduras. If you're from Latin America, you're from the top dog. They are the top dogs of the transplant world, and they have invited basically the keynote address on their first day of their annual conference in Denver, and that's on April 19th. And it's kind of like inviting T-Rex to their conference. When dinosaurs ruled the earth. You know what I'm going to say. So, but I think that's amazing. So that indicates that a revolution, or at least a rebellion, is taking place in the medical world on this very issue, that they are sick of cooperating with China. They have the Chinese publishing in their journals. They've already said that they cannot publish in the ISHLT journal, and they are looking to freeze China out of future cooperation, global medical cooperation. That is very significant. Okay. That means that frees up the politicians in Washington to do whatever they want and stop it with this, like, well, I don't know, not everything's been proven, on this. They don't have to do that anymore. If the doctors are buying into it, everybody can. So that's a case where we're looking at, again, a Cold War scenario. What happened to the Soviet psychiatrists? No one talked to them. Nobody would throughout the entire Cold War, because they were taking dissidents and torturing them in mental hospitals. Okay. And now we know far more about these hospitals, the transplant hospitals, than we ever knew about the Soviet mental hospitals. So I do see some, I don't mean to be too optimistic, but I do see some ways forward here. And I do see some motion, even if it's late in the day, taking place throughout the West. And I'm including Europe in that for this time, because I'm beginning to see it there as well.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Garrett.
I was going back to the the Cold War analogy, because in preparation for tonight, when I was asked to do this, I kept on thinking back to my favorite Mark Twain quote, which is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So one thing that I was thinking about and thinking about the Soviet analogy is that when I kind of was just simplifying the situation, and sometimes simplifying can be a real good way of kind of looking at the broad strokes of history, is that I've kind of been looking at Xi Jinping's premiership and presidency of communist China as a lot like Brezhnev, where Mao Zedong, Stalin, very similar types of leadership styles, suppression of enemies and dissidents, and then after Mao dies and after Stalin dies, somebody comes in and kind of de-Stalinizes and leads to an end of the Cultural Revolution and everything like that. And then there's a little bit of opening up to the West and everything like that. And now we get back to Brezhnev and Xi Jinping, where these two characters are kind of going back a little bit to the original format of the Communist Party in both of their countries. Or Brezhnev, increased military spending. What's it called? Now I'm forgetting the name, not the FSB, but the secret police, the KGB. The KGB, increased in its surveillance and its taking away of distance. Same thing that is happening in China under Xi Jinping. And I kind of feel like there is, definitely not exactly the same, but there is strokes between them that is. And I think that after Xi, there is a very good chance that we will face a Gorbachev character. How do you feel about that?
I don't know that the history will rhyme that way. I would just build on what you just said, though, a little bit. I mean, look at some of the other rhymes here. Belt and Road Initiative, right? China's plan to conquer the world. What's it leading to? A lot of unpaid debt, right? I mean, they loaned out a lot of money. They built a lot of infrastructure. And a lot of these countries, especially in Africa, are not paying them back. Does that remind you of something Brezhnev did? It certainly does with me. Okay, especially look at the South American investments. Amazing, amazing how similar they are.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying the Belt and Road Initiative project can't work. It actually has a much better chance than Brezhnev's project because, again, the Chinese are clever engineers. Okay, so when they come in, they build infrastructure that sometimes really works well, not like Soviet infrastructure.
They also have the people to spare to send them to go build it themselves and not have the Latin Americans build it.
Well, that's right. I mean, there are differences, but there's still the rhyme there because this isn't necessarily a successful program. And that's not because of COVID. That's because it wasn't well thought out. It was too ambitious. It assumed that these countries would sort of fall into line with China and would become prosperous in a sort of lifting all boats. It was very optimistic. That's not so far what's happening. Now, I'm going to be probably the next thing I'm doing after this book is to start looking at the Belt and Road Initiative full time. Because even if the Chinese are kind of dropping it as a toy, I want to see how that toy, what happened with it. Okay. Yeah. Because I think there are stories there and I think it's important to continue on that. But so that analogy is not that bad. I mean, it's different because again, it's China. They're not spending 50% of their GDP on the military, the way the Russians were starving everybody based on that. That is not happening. So there are a lot of differences. But the demographics are getting to be suddenly strikingly similar. We're not seeing a lot of people drinking vodka yet. Okay. Okay, like on that.
I was going to say the other historical art to rhyme. Obviously one is with Russia, but the other is the arc of various dynasties. And it's interesting, which undoubtedly, I mean, it has the advantage of it affects the thinking of Chinese leadership who are familiar with their history. And while obviously some dynasties lasted for centuries, it's interesting that the average length is about 70 to 80 years. When you to go back thousands of years and divide the number of dynasties. And it's interesting to kind of look at an analogy to what caused those various dynasties to get toppled. The loss of legitimacy, the loss of favor, that created a reaction that then resulted in a frequently splintering of the country, regionalization of the country. So we shall see. Any thoughts on that? We'll let that be one of your last words before you get to plug.
No, I would turn that over to my Taiwanese colleagues. I'll bring it up with them and see what they have to say about that. Often when I bring up these sorts of things, though, they kind of go, you're so off the mark. There's this tendency to do that. And actually, it's very interesting to get into these.
They're way too practical for that, I guess.
Exactly. They're extremely practical. Okay. And they're looking at this. Probably the problem, by the way, in Chinese defense is the confidence. If you just surpassed Japan on a personal GDP basis, wouldn't you be kind of confident? That's pretty good. This is that's substantial. Now, and they're not having the usual thing. They're starting to have a problem because they're not having enough babies either over here. Okay.
Well, one last question, because we're coming up to the top of our normal time. when can we expect your? This is the question your publisher is undoubtedly asking, right?
Where's the third book?
Where's the book?
I'm working on it. I just finished a major chapter on forced labor that came out to 22,000 words. So, I'm looking to do. My chapters are long and big. Okay, so but I am. Hopefully, I'm going to get it totally done by Christmas. We're over by Christmas. Okay.
Well, thank you, and we really enjoyed that, and we thank you that you got up so early in the morning in Taiwan to join us.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
It's not that.
It's a pleasure.
Early. It's a pleasure talking to you. I enjoyed the conversation. Okay, thank you very much, guys.
Right.
Anytime. I'll be leaving on the 15th. So, cheers.
Thank you to everybody who was watching as well.
Thank you, Dwight.